Welcome to the Discourses for Higher Enlightenment channel and another session of the Medford and Anonymous series. Please stay tuned.
This is a follow-up from the story from Pleasantville with that butterfly that when I had one of my first peak experiences. And when that butterfly was on my finger, remember, those who heard the talk or those who haven't, when that butterfly was on my finger and I was going through this, conscious, subconscious, superconscious, Holy Spirit oneness moment, I asked God with that butterfly on my finger, is it true? Was this man with no education, Edgar Cayce, whose biography I read 3 years before, There Is a River, the first biography, first book to ever make me cry, by the way. I didn't believe everything I read. So I was asking in that moment, is it true? Was this man really, is it true with the stories with this man? And same as I said with Yogananda and the miracles and Jesus being used to, raise people from the dead and Elijah. In that moment with the butterfly on my finger, I asked God, mentally, not verbally, is it true? Is all this true? So I had my answer at that moment. And so to continue on to put a more spotlight on Edgar, who remains probably my favorite godsend, especially as he explained the Bible in such compassionate terms and was practical in how we all can contact our higher mind and in conjunction with the Spirit. This is why I feel it's important to tell this detailed story of how he discovered more faith in his own gift, and like many Bible people, they'll still consider it when they hear the topic. I got a neighbor I told about Cayce, and they were very nice to me, but when they heard that he was able to do these things, right away they think the devil, and it turned them off. Even to my encounters with them a little bit, there's a bit of a distance. So he had this doubt and concern himself for many years in fear, but it was stories like the one we're about to share that helped him to see that it's really, it would be considered, I would say, the devil, that this child in the story you're going to hear would have died without his help, and I would say that would be the devil, whereas he was, not to give the whole story away, but there were different results than what even the doctor said would happen to this child. And thank God for his aunt, Carrie, who you'll discover who had so much faith in him that little by little this uneducated fellow from the farm realized his gift, his prayer from a youthful age was answered in this gift unfolding in his life and his acceptance of it, slowly but surely. So that's just an introduction and how it connects to that God is real story up in Pleasantville. And I can only go with I know is my highest moments and what I've heard, when I ask God that question. So I share this story, with everybody out there.
So how did you discover Edgar Cayce?
Well, it was a Jewish woman who I had met walking to the train station one night, and she told me about him, and she was just a really good spirit and, free spirit and first vegetarian woman I ever, met. And when she went back to California, she left such an impression on me that I picked up the biography. It still took me 6 months to pick up the biography, There Is a River. But when I did, that's the first book, as I say, that put tears in my eyes. And for those who might not have heard the story before, from Pleasantville, with the God is Real episode, I was looking for answers because my mom had died, the year or so before, and wasn't a churchgoer, but, did ask a question with my heart and my head, is there something there? If there is, where'd she go? And so I was looking, via books as we do, something to enhance the people, efforts that came my way growing up about such topics. So
well, I find that interesting. Is the faith in the questioning, or is the faith come through the experience? It seems to me that there's an element of faith to be questioning and seeking. And then you have the experience, and then it becomes real. But when does the faith happen? Is that the questioning moment, or is it? Do we already have faith?
Well,
Well, as we're questioning, and then the experience just solidifies it.
well, the faith wasn't. I got to say, my faith. I don't think my faith was very strong. I was more busy, in school and working since a young age. But to honestly question, I think, is part of. Because even God says in the Bible, prove me. So it's like saying he's saying challenge you. Just like Nancy was saying to Sidney, I challenge you. Prove this to be wrong. So to have honest questions, I think, is to be skeptical, to use the word, without being excessively skeptical. Where you just constantly got no belief at all. That's your belief, to have no belief in anything, beyond the visible. But most of us ask with our head, we're usually too fast. We don't really ask too much with our head and our heart. We don't slow down enough to really ask from the depths of our innermost being, where all our energies are concentrated within our heart and our head. And of course, for me, my mom raised us, so when she passed, that certainly got me off of the fast-pacedness of school and work and hanging out and so on, and things going very fast, and you're not really having big discussions about God on the streets in the Bronx up here in those years, even today. And so it's really just sincerely asking without abstractly, impulsively, there's something there. What's on TV now? Or I got to go out and make some money. I got no time to think about these things. But it's asking from your heart and your head. And usually, in my case, it was my mom's passing that I could just feel the emptiness in the room. I know I'm duplicating, for those who heard, I'm duplicating some of the stories in the God's Real episode. But for those who didn't listen to that one, that's when I realized I just felt this emptiness, and my whole being was, concentrated on questions of eternal questions. Who are we? Where do we come from? Are we more than the visible? Are we just extended animals? And this is a sincere desire to know. And my question also is there something there? Well, that's a skepticism. That's a doubt. I was asking honestly, not saying it in a arrogant way. There's nothing there. I didn't say there's nothing there, and I didn't say there's something there. I said, is there something there? It was in the middle. I guess I'd be a little bit agnostic. So,
Well, that's an interesting point, because we can start off with the rational mind because we look at the world around us and we question with our rational mind. There's got to be something more. I mean, but then there's something an experience we have that opens up the heart, and then you feel the reality of it.
Yeah, that's the key word, experience. Because otherwise, it's just, for most people hearing these stories, it's like, it sounds good, there'll be people interpret it as, was I on drugs? Was I all right in the head? Or did I have a dream about it? But I understand all that. I understand all of that from those perceptions, because these are people who don't have the experience. So I understand that, that honest questioning. But this didn't happen overnight. It was 3 years of meditation, trying to share, with people who were leading a destructive lifestyle, or death style, trying to be a friend in the midst of this chaos. So. And even to go beyond, to go too far out for most people, just even take some simple facts. We don't see the wind, but look what it did in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico. It moves the waters, moves buildings, it moves trees. We don't see our thoughts. To be honest, no scientist has been able to examine their thoughts under a microscope. So we believe in it, pertaining to ourselves, but so just to make that extension from that part of us that's invisible consciousness to something larger that may be out there that's connecting with us in here, it's just one little step, really. But to be honest, to look at the small step with our own thoughts, with the wind that we don't see, with gravity we don't see, these are all laws that manifest and have, very big consequences on the earth. So, in that sense, people jump that with their right away doubting something bigger out there when what's in front of their own nose, so to speak, or inside their own brain, which they can't see. That doesn't mean that they're not going to talk and write their articles, with some coming from a place using thoughts that they can't see. So in a way, they're already, it's a paradox right there. It's even a contradiction, because how could you doubt something that you're using? what I was thinking is I was looking at a book called True Tales from the Edgar Cayce Archives, Lives Touched and Lessons Learned from the Sleeping Prophet by Sidney and Nancy Kirkpatrick. So this is a book came out a couple years ago. It's like 30 stories, and there's a couple I have that are fairly short, so they don't take up too much time. But I think the introduction, it says a whole lot, because many people, I don't assume they know about Edgar Cayce, but so this may, I think it'll give a better understanding. So introduction, okay, why Edgar Cayce? This is Sidney Kirkpatrick talking. Like many journalists, I once arrogantly believed that psychic phenomena was a subject unworthy of serious study, and that anyone who put his faith in a trance medium was either fooling himself or the unwitting victim of a fraud. Then along came Nancy Webster, who would become my writing partner and wife. Edgar Cayce is going to be the subject of your next book, Nancy prophetically declared. Not wishing to be rude or condescending, I politely declined further discussion. But Nancy, a dedicated student of Cayce's work since she had been in high school, was unrelenting. Books and articles about the so-called sleeping prophet of Virginia Beach appeared in my mailbox with such regularity that to finally put the matter to rest, I read one. To say that the Cayce story challenged my imagination is an understatement. A backwoods Kentucky farm boy with an 8th grade education, he allegedly had the ability to enter into a deep hypnotic trance from which he could diagnose illnesses, witness events in the distant past, preview the future, and converse with angels. No subject was off limits, regardless of how simple or complex the question, whether it was help finding a lost pocket watch, how to perform a surgical procedure, or what to expect in the hereafter. Cayce would lie down on the couch, fold his hands over his stomach, seemingly drift off to sleep, and miraculously answer any question put to him. Rarely, if ever, was he proven wrong. In the course of his 41-year career, Cayce reportedly saved hundreds of people from intractable diseases and crippling injuries. A hospital dedicated to his healing arts was built in Virginia Beach, where patients received his trance readings, and specialty technology, years ahead of its time, was used to treat them. He guided the business interests of Detroit auto parts manufacturers, helped New York stockbrokers, along with Texas oilmen, become millionaires. He identified the location of buried treasure, solved a murder, and dictated trance-induced Hollywood screenplays. Yet Cayce and his family led lives of constant struggle and hardship, moving from home to home, often under threat of being persecuted for fortune-telling or practicing medicine without a license. He didn't profit from giving trance counsel, nor did he promote himself. For much of his life, he earned his livelihood as a portrait photographer and was a much-admired husband, father, and church deacon. Cayce's story was altogether too incredible to be true. This is why I suspected 50 years had elapsed since a comprehensive biography of Cayce had been written. No serious writer or journalist would devote time to making a rigorous examination of the facts because they wouldn't stand up to scrutiny. Dig deeper, and Cayce's story was sure to unravel, or so I suppose. Always a step ahead of me, Nancy would send me transcripts of Cayce's trance readings. Accompanying them was physicians' reports and convincing first-person testimony of how his recommended health treatments, frequently dismissed in his lifetime as the fanciful products of his imagination, had later become fully accepted by the mainstream medical community. Trance discourses he gave on such subjects as foods for health and healing, hydrotherapy, massage, and the intimate connection between psychological and physical health would earn Cayce this distinction as the undisputed father of today's holistic health movement. Information he gave on world history, physics, electrical engineering, and earth sciences also proved uncannily accurate. And though he died decades before widespread popular interest in paranormal phenomena, Cayce's trance readings on subjects such as remote viewing, life after death, reincarnation, the secret of the Sphinx, and the lost continents of Atlantis would set the standard by which nearly all metaphysical information has subsequently been judged. He was to the world of psychics and mediums what Babe Ruth, and I would say also Henry Aaron, was to the world of baseball. Most compelling, Cayce didn't speak in vague, ambiguous terms that were open for interpretation. interpretation, but used precise medical and scientific terminology well beyond his education and training. Further, he didn't perform these superhuman feats a few hundred times in the course of his career. He gave well over 16,000 trance readings, each one different and some lasting 30 minutes to an hour. On many occasions, professors from Ivy League universities, notable church leaders, bank presidents, historians, physicians, inventors, and scientists attended his trance sessions. Even this, however, was not what made the Cayce material most relevant, as his trance readings made clear their ultimate purpose was not simply to provide diagnostic insights to aid physicians, bring about miraculous cures, locate lost treasure, or to excite the intellect. They were provided to help individuals to understand and accept the truth of the multi-dimensional world in which we live. Cayce had provided incontrovertible evidence for the existence of a consciousness beyond our five senses. His work was an open door into another dimension, through which we can more fully understand ourselves and our place in the universe. The question that I was soon asking myself was not whether Cayce did what he was alleged to have done. The evidence was overwhelming, but how he did it. Thus began our study of Edgar Cayce, and along with it, a partnership was formed between myself, a non-believer, and Nancy, whose faith in Cayce never faltered. Together we would research Cayce's life and work as it had never been conducted before, producing his definitive biography, Edgar Cayce, an American Prophet, authoring numerous articles, contributing to movie and television projects, and most important, endeavoring to apply his trance guidance into our everyday lives and thus of our 4 children. A trip to Virginia Beach, Virginia was our starting point. Here at the Association for Research and Enlightenment are housed the Edgar Cayce archives, which consisted of an estimated 500,000 pages of trance readings, correspondence, family papers, and photographs. As Cayce primarily gave readings for particular individuals who requested his help and follow-up, biographical research had been conducted to determine the effectiveness of his advice. We had a massive collection of additional reference material which we would use to track down the people who received the readings and judge the truth for ourselves. The vast majority of names of these individuals meant little or nothing to us at the onset of our research, for they had led otherwise undistinguished lives as farmers, housewives, building contractors, musicians, students, and nurses, even an Alabama tombstone cutter. Children and adults from nearly any profession one can name came to Cayce for advice. However, among those individuals were names that we instantly recognized. Composer George Gershwin and Hollywood film pioneer Jesse Lasky had readings, as had inventors Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, electrical engineers at RCA and NBC, and the president and founder of Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. Readings were conducted for the mother of Ernest Hemingway on behalf of the husband of aviator Amelia Earhart also, and those surrounded in secrecy for President Woodrow Wilson. This aspect of Cayce's work had not heretofore been called attention to because Cayce had never promoted himself. He didn't trade on the names of the rich and the famous who consulted with him. For the same reason, he didn't charge a fee for giving readings. He believed that his gift was from God, and not to be used for selfish or self-serving purposes, but for the brotherhood of man. What the readings say is our collective purpose or soul's destiny. So basically, there's another page, but this is, I thought, a good introduction for people who didn't know, somewhat about Cayce, not to take it for granted that everybody does. Now, in the 30 stories that are here, I figured to start with one from Edgar's wife's aunt, whose name is Carrie House, and the title of this story is Her Dying Infant. It's a short story. It may go into part 2, but I think it'll say something in how he and others got more faith in what he was doing. So here's the story. Edgar and Gertrude were married on Wednesday, June 17, 1903, in a small ceremony held in the bride's rose garden. Among those present was Carrie Salter, herself recently married to the debonair Dr. Thomas House, a rising star in the Kentucky medical community. And it was she, not Gertrude, who championed Cayce's psychic gifts when Edgar partnered with Al Lane, and she who steadfastly remained at his side and encouraged him to continue providing medical advice when Lane, under investigation by the board of the American Medical Association, left Hopkinsville to pursue a formal medical degree. In contrast to Carrie, Gertrude was frightened by Edgar's strange trance ability. Later, that her husband risked losing his voice than his sanity, she believed. She was also concerned about sharing Edgar with what became a growing number of physicians, researchers who, in secret, were experimenting with her husband and treating him as if he was some strange and exotic specimen, not a flesh and blood human being. Nor did she want his third other, the source, interfering in their lives. She couldn't very well have a fairy tale marriage when her mate might suddenly drift into a coma-like sleep and become some other person, or worse still, might not wake from that sleep. And what of their children? Would they inherit this weird ability? Carrie had no such concern. She believed that Edgar was touched by the divine and that a heavenly spirit spoke in and through him when he was in a trance. Her faith in him had also proven its value in what may have been his earliest trance reading for a female conducted by Lane, some friend of Cayce's. The source advised Carrie not to undergo an abdominal surgery recommended by her doctors, which indeed turned out to be unnecessary. After Carrie's marriage to Dr. House, the chief physician at the Hopkinsville Mental Asylum, the source had also predicted that she would become pregnant, something that Dr. House and two specialists had said was physically impossible. Further, the source had accurately foretold the date of birth and said she would deliver a boy. And the spiritual message that had accompanied Cayce's prophetic trance discourses, that God's love and forgiveness must be foremost in her heart, had inspired her to give up her position at Anderson's department store and minister to the patients at the asylum as an RN working alongside her husband. Most compelling of all was a reading Edgar subsequently gave to the 3-month-old Thomas House Jr. in November 1909. As Cayce had suggested in a previous trance session, the child's delivery might be difficult with complications setting in. This turned out to be the case. Born prematurely, her child suffered from severe infantile spasms, nausea, and vomiting. This condition had deteriorated to the critical point when Carrie sent word to fetch Edgar in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where he and Gertrude were operating a photography studio. Little Tommy Jr. was too weak from malnutrition to nurse from Carrie's bosom or to even wrap his tiny hands around her finger. She needed Edgar as never before. Carrie's husband, Dr. House, and two other physicians, Dr. Jackson, a general practitioner in Hopkinsville, and Dr. Haggard, a pediatric specialist from Nashville, who had been attending the child since birth, believed that Thomas House Jr. had little or no chance of living through the night. Carrie wasn't sure Edgar or anyone else could help her son, no more than Edgar himself was, but she wanted to try. Like most physicians in Hopkinsville, Dr. Haggard wanted no part of what he deemed trickery. Dr. Jackson shared his colleague's skepticism, but as the family's longtime physician, he had seen the inexplicable. Cayce, with Lane's help, had provided trance advice that had helped the child recover from whooping cough and had correctly diagnosed the case of scarlet fever. In what was deemed to be an even more startling trance discourse, Cayce had detailed the location of blood clots in a patient's lung, and along with more routinely recommended treatments, he advised the use of state-of-the-art electromagnetic therapy. Physicians hadn't followed up such therapy, had never been used before in Kentucky, and was considered experimental at best. Jackson had been left wondering if the treatment might have helped, but it was too late now. The patient had died. Dr. House also didn't believe that Edgar or anyone else could diagnose illness in his sleep, but he, like Jackson, knew Cayce too intimately to believe that he was a charlatan. His in-law didn't charge for his services, seek publicity, or encourage anyone to obtain trance readings. After all, after Lane had left for medical school in 1904, people found their way to Cayce's Bowling Green photo studio by word of mouth. House believed that the people who came to Cayce were predisposed that Cayce could help, and hence the people heard what they wanted to hear. Physicians working with Edgar did the rest. Only a dying child, such as Tommy Jr., was another matter altogether. The child was beyond help. The only reason that Dr. House reluctantly agreed to wire Cayce in Bowling Green was to indulge headstrong Carrie, who to his mind was overcome with fear and unwilling to accept what he deemed to be the inevitable. Edgar arrived by train to Hopkinsville in the midst of a rainstorm. Gertrude's brother Lynn picked him up at the station and drove him the mile and a quarter to the house. Both were drenched head to foot when they stepped into the parlor. Carrie, holding her infant son, was seated in the parlor by the fireplace, surrounded by family members. There were no pleasantries, only an awkward silence as Dr. Haggard, disgruntled that Cayce was to be consulted, packed his bags and left. He encouraged Dr. Jackson to do the same, lest he was investigated as had been Lane. Let the child die in peace. was the message he conveyed to the House family, whether he spoke the words or not. Carrie asked if Edgar wanted to examine Tommy. Edgar demurred. In his conscience state, he could no more diagnose the child's condition than he could speak a foreign language or play a musical instrument. Besides, he was anguished to see Carrie and her child in such distress. Gertrude likely had accompanied Edgar to the hill that night for the same reason. Perhaps, too, she was protesting the fact that Edgar, despite his promise to her, was back experimenting with his gifts. Dr. House, accompanied by Jackson, conducted the session in the master bedroom adjoining the parlor. The process previously developed by Lane was for him to read from a small leather-bound pocket notebook. He had only to sit beside Edgar as he went into trance, watching for his in-laws' eyelashes to flutter before putting the suggestions to him. Similar to the routine he practiced with Lane and would do without significant variation for the next 36 years, Edgar took off his jacket and shoes, removed his tie and collar, lay down on a large oak bed. He pulled a down comforter over his stocking feet, adjusting himself on his back. Then, with feet together and fingertips at his temples, Edgar concentrated on a spot on the ceiling. When he felt himself about to drift off to sleep, he slowly lowered his hands and crossed them over his chest. With the rain pounding on the roof and the weak cries of the dying child in the next room, Edgar's breathing deepened and his eyelashes flooded. "You have before you the body of Thomas House, Jr. of Hopkinsville, Kentucky," Dr. House said, inserting his son's name in the paragraph he read from the pocket notebook. "Diagnose his illness and recommend a cure." Edgar looked fast asleep. Only Dr. House knew better. He had once seen his in-law go into a trance so deep that fellow physicians conducting an experiment had removed one of Cayce's fingernails, and another had stuck a hypodermic needle into his foot. Edgar hadn't so much as stirred, yet the sleeping Cayce answered questions as if he were fully conscious. Edgar began to speak in his normal voice. Here, in many instances to come, his first words were garbled, almost a hum, as if a musical instrument would be in tune. Then his voice cleared and his words became well modulated and easy to understand. "Yes, we have the body and mind of Thomas House, Jr. here," he said. Cayce proceeded to recite the infant's temperature and blood pressure as House and Jackson would note. The information was correct. They had taken Tommy's vitals a few minutes before Edgar had arrived at the hill. Only Edgar had not examined the child. How would he know? Cayce in trance next described the condition of Tommy's organs, doing so in such a detailed and detached manner that House and Jackson were left with the impression that he was a physician conducting an autopsy. In this case, however, the physician looked to be asleep, and his patient was cradled in his mother's arms in the next room. This information, too, appeared to be correct or to confirm to what House and Jackson supposed. Only there was no way to know such things for certain. Was Edgar somehow reading their minds, picking up on what the two physicians were thinking? House and Jackson soon dismissed this possibility when Cayce described an epileptic condition which he declared was causing the child severe infantile spasms, nausea, and vomiting. Further, Cayce explained that this condition was the outcome of the child's premature birth, which in turn had been the result of his mother's poor physical condition during the early months of her pregnancy. In conclusion, Cayce recommended that the child be given a measured dose of belladonna, administered orally, to be followed by wrapping his body in a steaming hot poultice made from the bark of a peach tree. The session ended as mysteriously as it had begun. We are through for the present. Reading from the same notebook, House instructed Cayce to regain consciousness. Cayce dutifully followed the command and awoke. In a few minutes that it took Edgar to regain consciousness, stretch his arms and legs, and then sit up from the bed, the two physicians had already left the room. Edgar was alone, worried that the trance session had been a failure, and wondering whether the reading was successful. He walked across the room and peered through the parlor, partially open door. House and Jackson were in the parlor, deep in discussion and obviously agitated. The two physicians both agreed that the diagnosis sounded reasonable. The recommended cure was what upset them. Belladonna, a toxic form of deadly nightshade, could be lethal. Even if the peach tree poultice could somehow leach the poison out of the child's system, administering a large dose of the drug to an infant in little Tommy's condition was murder. Jackson made his feelings clear to Carrie. "You'll kill little Tommy for sure." Dr. House concurred. Homeopathic belladonna could be used to treat lung and kidney ailments, but pure belladonna, as Cayce had recommended, was used only in topical ointments. Edgar joined the others in the parlor but couldn't contribute to the ensuing discussion. He didn't remember anything that he said in trance. One minute he was wide awake, the next he was fast asleep. That's how he perceived what always took place. As Al Lane liked to remark, Edgar was the only one who never got to experience one of his own readings. Anxiety became fear when Edgar finally understood the full import of the information that had come through. His session with Arlene and others had been experiments. No one could get hurt. Now he had to face the horrific possibility that the treatment he recommended could and likely would, according to House and Jackson, result in Tommy's death, a family member and mere child no less. Carrie had more faith in the trance advice than Edgar himself. She believed that sleeping Cayce was an instrument of God's divine love and compassion. This night, God was reaching out to her and her child. If Cayce in trance told her to poison her son in order to save his life, she would act on the information. Dr. House could not say the same. Common sense, along with decades of medical training, told him that Cayce couldn't possibly be doing what he appeared to have done. Until now, he had looked at what Edgar was doing as mere entertainment, all the tricks at best. Carrie demanded that he prepare the belladonna, despite his very great reservations and a threat from Dr. Jackson that he could lose his medical license and possibly be brought up on charges of manslaughter. He retrieved the drug from his doctor's bag. He left Carrie too deeply to act otherwise. And regardless of how this might end his promising career, he could at least console himself by knowing that his son would surely die if nothing else was done. He would be putting little Tommy out of his misery. Lynn Evans led Edgar outside to collect the ingredients for the poultice that had been recommended in the treatment. Edgar climbed a peach tree and the orchard behind the barn, opened his pocket knife and cut the bark away from the freshest growth. He handed the bark down to Lynn, and they took it into the kitchen at the rear of the house where Carrie's sister Kate had put a kettle on the stove to boil. Kate prepared the hot poultice and then carried it into the parlor where others were waiting at the child's side. Dr. House dissolved the white powder into a spoonful of water. Carrie then opened Tommy's mouth, poured the liquid inside, and massaged his neck until he swallowed. Then she wrapped the naked child in the steaming hot towels dipped in peach tree solution. Edgar remained outside, standing on the veranda in the rain. He didn't join the others in the parlor because, as he later said, he couldn't stand the thought of seeing Tommy House die in his mother's arms. Gertrude had been right in not coming. He understood this now. He heard no cries coming from inside the parlor. As the others described what happened, Tommy instantly fell asleep. Dr. House in his later report noted that this was the child's first deep and uninterrupted rest since birth. Tommy awoke hours later, drenched in sweat, cheeks pink, breathing steadily, and nursed at Carrie's breast. He never had a convulsion again. The miracle, as Carrie and Dr. House would forever describe Tommy's recovery, impacted the lives of everyone on the hill that night and many thousands of others to come. Carrie and her family would receive over 200 readings in the next 3 decades ahead. She not only continued to champion and defend Edgar, but also encouraged others to seek his counsel. She became one of his most adept students with the life-transforming messages of love and hope. She was found in the Cayce readings. She would later join Edgar and Gertrude when they left for Virginia Beach, and she would become chief of the nursing department at the Cayce Hospital. In addition to her capacity as an RN, she would help explain the readings to those who sought Cayce's counsel, most notably young mothers. Dr. House underwent a personal crisis. What he had witnessed at the Hill that night made it impossible for him to return to practicing medicine as he had been taught. A rising star in the medical community, once under consideration to become head of the American Medical Association, he left his practice at the Hopkins Asylum, turned his back on standard allopathic medicine as practiced by his colleagues, and embraced the type of holistic treatment put forth in the trance readings. Along with his wife, he moved to Virginia Beach, where he became the Cayce Hospital's chief physician. Tommy House Jr. would grow healthy and strong and also make his home in Virginia Beach. A gifted engine mechanic and repairman, he personally built the health equipment recommended in the readings. Today, patients still use the batteries he first assembled for the electromagnetic therapy prescribed to treat a wide variety of illnesses, including conditions that were similar to his own. Oftentimes, at great personal expense, he would drive hundreds of miles to deliver readings and medical equipment to patients unable to come in person to receive Cayce's help. Equally profound was the impact Tommy House Jr. had on Edgar. He had proven to himself and others the life-saving potential of his work, regardless of how unusual and sometimes altogether unbelievable the information that came through in his reading. He would never again doubt the good that could result. From this day forward, he would dedicate a portion of his time each day to giving readings. No one who genuinely needed and wanted help would be refused. And although it would still be several years before Gertrude herself would become his partner in what he was now beginning to call the Word, thanks to Carrie's courage and example, she would conduct more readings than anyone else. So how's that for a detailed description of of what's possible with God. I mean, that's in essence that's what it was about. I have another one here, another story in the True Tales from the Edgar Cayce archives. It's called Dwight Moody, a pastor in this life and the next. The Union Tabernacle was the place to be on weekend nights in Hopkinsville, the county seat, with stadium seating for 2,000. The block-long Civic Auditorium played host to Vice Presidential candidate Theodore Roosevelt, African-American educator Booker T. Washington, temperance leader Carrie Nation, and orator William Jennings Bryan, and the band leader John Philip Sousa. 18-year-old Edgar Cayce, a frequent visitor, came to hear the evangelist. There was the soul-saving and eternal optimist former baseball star Billy Sunday, the advocate of Christian education George Stewart, the feisty and always humorous Sam Jones, and Mordecai Ham, the preacher, how about this, who later converted Billy Graham at a revival meeting in North Carolina. Edgar eagerly awaited the arrival of the immensely popular and charismatic Dwight L. Moody, known simply as DL, who sometimes drew 10 and 12,000 people to hear his sermons. On the morning before Moody was scheduled to speak, April 5th, 1898, Edgar was living with his family in a white clapboard home on the corner of 7th and Young Streets, a short walk from the Tabernacle. He had grown to be quite tall, standing just over 6'2" with tousled brown hair he cut short, which accentuated his high forehead, deep-set blue-gray eyes, and receding chin. As his father was still unemployed since leaving Beverly 2 years earlier, Edgar's salary as a clerk in Hopper's Brothers bookstore was now his family's sole means of support. Still, Edgar had chores to perform. Among his responsibilities was to milk the family cow, which that Tuesday morning had gone missing. Edgar followed the cow's tracks through an open gate at the back of the house, across a meadow, down a riverbank, and along a creek that ran through the middle of town. After he followed the creek some 100 or so yards, he came upon a middle-aged, overweight man seated on a log. He had a great beard, which had begun to turn white, like his hair. Edgar couldn't help but notice that he held a Bible in his hands. "Good morning, young man," the stranger said. "I venture you are seeking this cow here just behind me. She must have come up to this way from the path you came over." Edgar asked him how he knew he was looking for the cow. Dressed in a suit jacket and vest, he didn't think he still looked like a farm boy. It was the anxiety in his face that gave him away, Dwight Moody replied, and he then introduced himself. They got to talking, and their conversation inevitably turned to the Bible, the bookstore, and Edgar's desire to become a preacher. Moody then invited him as his guest to attend his revival at the Tabernacle, which was scheduled to run an entire week. Edgar showed up that night and was very impressed. He sat in the front row amidst the standing room only crowd. The text Moody read from was the Gospel of Luke 10:25, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Edgar had read it many times and heard various interpretations, but he had never heard it treated in quite the same way as Moody presented the subject. Edgar communicated his excitement to Moody the next morning when he found the evangelist waiting for him at the same place he had found him the day before. He and D.L. continued to meet by the river for Moody's entire visit to town. Edgar would ask Moody the same question that he had put to many different pastors. Had God ever spoken directly to him? Asked what had prompted the young man to pose such a question, Edgar told Moody the stories of his early childhood, as Edgar's own readings of the Bible revealed to him, and Lulu, the friend of his, had drawn to his attention. The devil often spoke through spirits. How could he be sure? You can tell a tree by its fruit, Moody reminded Edgar. Then shared stories with him of people, many of them children, who had received messages from God. Moody also shared his own experience on a trip to Cleveland to hold a revival meeting. The planned visit was to last a few weeks and a large audience was expected. But no sooner did he arrive Then he had a dream in which he was told to close his meeting at once and go to London, England. As Moody had never been to England and could hardly afford doing so, he was reluctant. However, as he believed his dream to be a genuine expression of the will of God, he prematurely ended the Cleveland revival and, at the risk of stalling a promising career, set off for England where no one knew who he was. Moody felt like a stranger in London and began doubting that his vision had been authentic. Then one afternoon, when he was wandering the streets in a poor section of the city, he came upon a window box on a nearby tenement in which a geranium bloomed. This was his favorite color and flower. Stepping closer to take a closer look, he heard an angelic voice singing a favorite hymn. He followed the voice inside the tenement and up to the stairs to an open door. Inside was a young crippled girl. "Oh, Mr. Moody," she said, looking up at him, "I knew God would answer my prayer and send you here." The experience left Moody convinced that his coming to the child's apartment had been God's plan. He resumed his ministry with a prayer meeting in that same room and eventually touched the lives of 250,000 or more people in England. "I know it was God who spoke to me," Moody told Edgar. Edgar would cherish his conversations with Moody as much as he did the evangelist Union Tabernacle revival meetings. In each new sermon, Edgar would find what seemed like a special message intended just for him. Simply listening to Moody, Edgar said, sent chills up his spine. What he remembered most was the last morning they met. Edgar had arrived before sunrise and found Moody holding a stick and making marks in the soil, just as the book of John reported Jesus having done. Moody asked Edgar what he was going to do with his life. Edgar confessed that he wanted to be a minister like him. Moody advised him to be true to the spirit of that vision, but to know that there were many different ways to serve God besides being from the pulpit. He could be a missionary or teach Bible study. He would know the right path when the time came. For many years to come, long after Moody had died, Edgar would reflect on how special their meetings had been. And though he never again spoke personally with him in the flesh and blood, Moody would appear in both his dreams and trance-induced visions. In one trance vision, Edgar was on a moving passenger train riding on an ornate white and gold Pullman car with plush club chairs. Outside, he could hear the noise of the wheels rolling on the tracks and the blast of the train whistle. His fellow passengers were preachers dressed in white robes, many of whom Edgar had heard preach as a youth in Hopkinsville. Though long since dead, they appeared to Edgar as they did at the height of their careers. Conversing with them, Edgar learned that they were on their way to attend a revival meeting in which John the disciple was to speak. Edgar was along for the ride. Among the passengers was Sam Jones, who was making jokes and chewing tobacco, just as he did when he was a circuit-riding revivalist when Jones spit out the tobacco juice. Edgar was taken aback, surprised at the preacher's lack of decorum in such a fine Pullman. As Edgar himself wanted a cigarette, he queried Jones, "Sam, aren't you afraid you will get the tobacco juice on the cushions?" Jones didn't think anything of it. In Edgar's dream, life went on as normal in the afterlife as it did when he was in the flesh and blood. Another passenger was Dwight Moody, whom Edgar was especially pleased to meet again after so many years. He asked Moody if he remembered meeting him in Hopkinsville. "Oh yes," Moody said, "I remember you, and I remember the tale I told you about the little girl." As they got to talking, Moody said that Edgar was not in the same place as himself or the others on the train. "You are on the same train with us right now, but don't forget, you have to go back and don't you get too far away." The other passengers, pleased to be together, were discussing sermons they had given and what had been their experience in the afterlife. One preacher said that he thought he had gotten it right when he was in the pulpit, while others didn't think that they had. Jones said, "Well, things are quite a bit different from what I preached or imagined they were." Then he turned to George Stewart and said, "George, don't you find it that way?" George said that things were indeed quite different. "We are still going to meetings. The only difference is that we are being preached to instead of preaching. But we have found that we didn't know it all." At another point in the dream, all of the preachers turned to Moody to find what he thought. "D.L., how do you find it?" Jones asked. Moody replied, "Well, it isn't so different. You know, what we called human nature is still human nature. It isn't so different." Edgar had the impression that these men were having just as good a time in the afterlife as they did when they were alive. He wanted to continue the journey with them to hear the disciple John speak, but was counseled to disembark before they reached a tunnel that lay ahead. You must get off before it goes too far, Cayce was warned. In similar visions he experienced in trance, Cayce always had to get off the train. However, there was one dream he had in 1942 in which he arrived at his destination. The dream made such an impact on him that he wrote it down for later study and reflection. I was sitting alone in the front room of my Virginia Beach house playing solitaire when there was a knock at the front door. When I went to the door, a gentleman whom I did not recognize said, "Cayce, I want you to go with me to a meeting this evening." At first I said, but I seldom go out in the evening. He insisted I should go with him, and I did. As I went out, I realized that another person was waiting for us in the street. We walked on as if into the air, and up we went until we came to where there seemed to be a large circus tent. We approached the flap of the tent, and as he pulled back the flap back, I for the first time realized that the two men in whom I had been walking were the evangelists Dwight Moody and Sam Jones. In Cayce's dream, they entered the tent, which was filled to overflowing with inspirational religious leaders, some of them whom we remembered, who Edgar recognized, and some he did not. And then Cayce remembered, it seemed that there was lightning in the distance. With the lightning, there was a noise, not of thunder, but of wind, yet nothing seemed to stir. When I asked one of my companions what it was, I was told, "The Lord our God will speak to us." Then a voice clear and strong came as from out of a cloud in the lightning, and it said, "Who will warn my children?" Then from out of the throng before the throne came the Master. He spoke, saying, "I will warn my brethren." The answer came back, "No, the time is not yet fulfilled for you to return." Then Mr. Moody spoke and said, "Send Cayce, he is there now." Then the Master said, "Father, Cayce will warn my brethren." Here the dream ended, but the message for Cayce remained. So there's another story of true tales of Dwight Moody God inspiring Dwight Moody to inspire Edgar, how Dwight Moody gave up speaking to thousands of people to go to a place he'd never been to, following a dream, and there was a young crippled girl who was praying for him to come to her, and ended up where 500,000 people eventually heard the message of the Lord through Dwight Moody in London or England. And so, you get these little connections, and I didn't know that Billy Graham, who played a big part also in inspiring many people, he was himself converted by this man, Mordecai Ham. How's that for news?
Well, that's an interesting thing, at those seeming coincidences. When you were first reading the story, it's interesting how he ran into this guy, and it's like
synchronicity. Well, it's just, I think, remember you heard the saying, when the student's ready, the teacher appears. So there was somebody coming into his life because, he didn't have no education to speak of, and there was a man who, was very well respected throughout the country, and he didn't put him down and said, about Cayce's vision of the angelic lady who he saw, and she said, "What do you want?" And he said, "I want to help people, especially children." So that's what would manifest later on in his life, as he himself struggled with his gift, if it was from God or the devil, and coming up against intellectual people and doctors, and what did he know? But as we've discussed, all the times that the doctors couldn't help people, Edgar, God's gift, was able to help these people. And so you got to ask the question, like I said, if somebody wasn't helped, wouldn't that be the devil if they died young? Or that little girl, Amy Dietrich, for those who haven't heard the story, having 20 convulsions a day. Imagine being the parents of a baby girl to what she was 2 years old when she started the convulsions till 5, and she didn't know who her parents were. And you got this young fella, and her parents were rich, so they went to, they had the best doctors. So when people just flippantly say, well, that's the devil, and you're able to do these things, I agree, you have to be discerning, but to me it would be more the devil if the girl was allowed to suffer that way and be in pain, and the parents couldn't even recognize her. as far as talk to her, or she didn't know the parents. So,
Well, there's a biblical scripture where he talks about there's gifts of prophecy and there's gifts of healing. That's what he had. People who just have that automatic reaction. Oh, what? He's going into a seance.
Right.
He's going into a trance and receiving messages. Where's this coming from? But actually, there is scripture to back that up. That certain people have those gifts, and the problem is that it's so few in number that people don't really experience it, and they hear it and they have that automatic reaction.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's like they say with Benjamin Bannister, it's impossible to run the mile under 4 minutes. And once he did it, others started to do it. But it's certainly biblically based. I mean, the promise is there that you can be used. I mean, there's a part of the Bible in John that Jesus says, "Know ye not, ye are gods." Not that we're God, but we're sons of God.
Didn't you say something about you could do greater things than these?
That's right. He said, you can do greater things because I go back to the Father. And so when you're very accurate when you say very few people. I mean, it wasn't many disciples in Jesus' time that he picked. It wasn't. Then they eventually became the 70 when the Pentecost came down on them. The Holy Spirit. They were performing all these miracles. And there weren't many Old Testament prophets.
And the gift of healing is minimal.
The gift of healing, I mean, like we discussed, Catherine Coleman had that. I have yet to find somebody like her, but there's no shortage of God's ability to pour His Spirit into this tiny sesame seed of a planet, given the cosmos, size of the galaxies, the billions of galaxies. So God's Spirit is everywhere, and who allows it to come through? That's the question that confronts us all. Who will allow that? Who will challenge, put that to the test? Like God says, prove me, and I pour you out a blessing you can't hold. So we need to break away from our inertia, our conditioned mindset, that makes us believe that these things are not possible. So that's why it's very good to show these few people who have these unusual abilities or given these abilities to encourage the rest of us, because in truth, all of us are from that creative intelligence, and we all have that divine spark within us, and it takes a lot of work to go find it and utilize it in a very selfless way, not seeking the fame and the fortune and whatever else intoxicates most of us down here. So, that's the promise. I mean, that is the promise offered. Seek ye the kingdom, and everything will be added. So it's just a matter of taking the challenge and putting it, taking God's word and in patience, putting it to the test and applying these truths of life about eating well and meditating and sharing your prayers and sharing your deeds with your neighbors and, your animals and and your neighbor could be somebody from another part of the world. So, so that's what we're giving a reminder about,
This concludes this discourse.